Back over a year ago, many of us had the utmost displeasure to watch what remains one of the worst dinosaur documentaries ever made, Dinosaur with Stephen Fry. Back then, when I made my videos on it, I said that in response I would go back and retrospectively review all of the Walking with Dinosaurs and other shows to highlight how a good dinosaur documentary is made. Well, things got in the way of that, however finally I've gotten around to doing the first of these retrospective reviews, and today I thought I would start with the show that I think Dinosaur with Stephen Fry wanted to be. So let's head to a world where extinction doesn't have to be forever.
Welcome to the ultimate wildlife sanctuary. Welcome to Prehistoric Park.
Hitting screens in the early 2000s, Prehistoric Park has in recent years gathered a bit of a cult following, and in many ways I think this show was more revolutionary than other similar programs like Walking with Dinosaurs. Prehistoric Park came with its own unique premise and a cast of characters both human and animal that gave the show a very different feel. In this retrospective, I want to explore the show's production, its premise and episodes, as well as looking into what remains great about the show and what has over the years become a little dated, with the ultimate purpose being to answer a simple question: does Prehistoric Park still hold up? Just as a short note, at times I'll be directly quoting various cast or crew members or giving information specifically gathered from different sources. For this, I'll include an on-screen reference just to explain where everything is coming from.
If Nigel can make extinct animals feel at home anywhere, it's here.
The early 2000s had been an interesting time for paleo documentaries. The overwhelming success of Walking with Dinosaurs in 1999 had been followed by further shows. Walking with Beasts in 2001 and Walking with Monsters in 2005 had completed the trilogy of life that Tim Haynes, producer of Walking with Dinosaurs, had wanted to make. However, within that trilogy were a couple of unique programs that in many ways set the ground for Prehistoric Park's future success. Between 2002 and 2003, the BBC commissioned several other shows to be made by Impossible Pictures, the production studio behind the Walking With franchise. These would take the form of several special episodes. The Giant Claw and Land of the Giants would be single episodes, much in the same way as the Walking with Dinosaurs special The Ballad of Big Al. A further program, Sea Monsters, would be made as an episodic program similar to the standard Walking With style. These programs all continued the standards of the other Walking With shows, with CGI animals supported by live action backdrops and animatronics, with nature documentary style scripting and camera work. However, there was a key difference with all three of these programs. Unlike the Walking With programs that took a nature documentary style, with narration backing the scenes being shown, these specials would include real human characters alongside the CGI animals. Human characters would not only provide the exposition for the audience, but would also directly interact with these animals and the environment. For these specials, the naturist Nigel Marvin would make his mark, providing a sort of Steve Irwin-esque character. More on him in a bit. It is within these specials that you can see the roots of what would make Prehistoric Park a unique paleo documentary. The implementation of real human characters, with even the cameraman behind the lens being at risk, adds a certain energy to many shots. Instead of the perfect documentary style of the Walking With shows, these specials were happy to include mobile camera shots as well as some added scripted jeopardy. A good example of that is a scene during the Sea Monsters show where a cliffhanger ending suggests that Nigel may have been eaten by the Megalodon. I think it's clear going back to watch these initial special shows that Prehistoric Park very much took the elements that were established within them and ran with them. Now, much of Prehistoric Park's development is unknown, but let's look at what we do know. At some point prior to 2006, and probably just after the finishing of the Sea Monsters specials in 2003, ITV commissioned a new paleo documentary that would become Prehistoric Park, working along with Impossible Pictures, who would produce the show. For those unaware, this was already a big change. The previous shows created by Impossible Pictures had been made for the BBC. Those out of Britain will be unaware that the BBC and ITV are kind of rivals within British television. No one has explained why Prehistoric Park was made by ITV and not BBC, or why Impossible Pictures chose to work with ITV at this time. One thing, however, that should be noted is that when Impossible Pictures made Walking with Dinosaurs and Walking with Beasts, they were part of the BBC officially. However, this ended in 2002 when they became their own independent private company, with Tim Haynes being its founder. ITV have never revealed how much the show cost to produce, but given the expense of these programs at the time, we can assume that Prehistoric Park was not cheap to create. The premise of the show was driven by a simple phrase, according to Jasper James, the executive producer on the program. He explained that conservationists often use the phrase "extinction is forever," and as such the team for Prehistoric Park decided to turn that on its head for the show's tagline, "What if extinction didn't have to be forever?" Prehistoric Park was never designed to be a zoo, but was instead a wildlife sanctuary, with its animals being part of a conservation program as opposed to some sort of Jurassic Park tourist location. The concept of the program called for a time-traveling animal rescuer to travel back in time to rescue the animals from their extinctions, and would incorporate a focus on how to look after the animals in the current day. A cast of human characters would be part of the show from day one, and ITV got two big names in. The programme's narrator would take the form of David Jason, well known to British TV watchers as the charismatic Del Boy from Only Fools and Horses, as well as the no-nonsense detective Frost. David Jason brought his unique and legendary voice to the show. Nigel Marven would be the other big name ITV would get for Prehistoric Park. Nigel Marven is a well-known British wildlife TV presenter, conservationist and author. Bringing to many programs his unique spontaneous style, he is to me very similar in many ways to the late great Steve Irwin, with a style that his Wikipedia entry calls daring. Nigel had been working for ITV since 1998, where in his first program he had demonstrated his daring nature by swimming alongside a great white shark without a cage for a program called Giants. His work with paleo animals would start with Giant Claw, which premiered on the BBC to 7 million viewers, going on to star in other paleo documentaries including Prehistoric Park. He has continued to produce wildlife shows in recent years, and in 2024, a species of thylacine relative would be named Gamma-Lacinus nigelmarveni in honour of his work with both prehistoric animals and current day animals. Alongside Nigel, however, would be several other characters worth mentioning. Chief among these would be Susan McNabb, a real-world veterinarian. Suzanne would play herself as Prehistoric Park's chief vet to provide medical care for the numerous unique animals that Nigel would be bringing back to the real world. In the making of special provided by Prehistoric Park's DVD, Suzanne explains how she first heard of the job. A proper job advert was placed in a veterinary journal alongside the horse vet. Do you want to be a dinosaur vet? This piqued her interest and she would go on to bring her veterinary knowledge to the show. The show also required its park manager, its Ray Arnold character. This would take the form of Bob, the park keeper played by Rod Arthur. Bob is largely considered the comic relief for the show, with Jasper James confirming that he would play around with Bob and ensure things would always go wrong around him to provide the program with some levity. Bob himself is a warm and very genuine character with a clear interest in the animals, but also takes his park-keeping job very seriously. Alongside our human cast would of course be the show's animals. Nigel Marven explained that selecting the animals for the show was one of the hardest aspects. Unlike the Walking With programs, Prehistoric Park had the distinct advantage of not being restricted to a singular period of Earth history, meaning that the producers could select animals from the last 500 million years. Nigel explained the process of selecting animals. Of course, they wanted to include the famous animals like the T-Rex, but also wanted to include less well-known animals, as well as new discoveries made since the days of Walking with Dinosaurs. Guiding the animal part of the program would be a team of paleontologists, just like the Walking With programs, the fossil evidence, and trace fossil evidence. To bring the fossils back to life, Impossible Pictures would work alongside the experts at Framestore to create the CGI animals for the show. Framestore made their mark on Walking with Dinosaurs, and as such, by the time of Prehistoric Park, they were able to bring their significant knowledge and expertise in regards to the CGI work to the show. Much like the Walking With shows, however, CGI would not be the only way animals would be brought back to life. Physical animatronics created by a company called Crawley Creatures would also be used in the show, especially when a physical interaction with someone or something was needed. These animatronics are basically rubber puppets with all the expected animatronic features. Along with the human cast, the expertise and the artists who would make the animals, the show also needed a unique location to call its own. Karen Kelly, another of the show's producers, explained that finding the right location for Prehistoric Park was vital, as the producers did not want the audience to feel sorry for the animals coming from a wide open prehistoric landscape to tiny cages. It was important to maintain the conservationist feel as opposed to a zoo. Nigel also stated that it was important that the park's location would have environmental features such as mountains and valleys to keep the animals safe should they escape. Prehistoric Park itself is formed from actually multiple real-world locations. The main complex, this set of thatched structures, is the Didymmer Camp and Cathedral Peak Resort, located in the Drakensberg Mountains on the borders of Lesotho. Many other scenes of the park were filmed at the Crockweld Conservation Centre in South Africa. However, other locations in the park were filmed in Australia. Mammoth Mount, which would become home to the real elephants in the show as well as a rescued mammoth, would be filmed at the Natal Lion Park. For their prehistoric worlds, the cast and producers would film in locations all around the world, including Brazil, Chile and British Columbia. Creating each episode from these components started with the storyboarding, with each of the 6 episodes laid out in detail, shot to shot, to help guide the producers and the CGI teams. For Prehistoric Planet, artist Louis Kerr would be called upon, who's gone on to work on such films as Despicable Me 3 in recent years. Once storyboarded, the real work would begin. To create the CGI scenes from the show, Framestore utilised a similar method to Walking with Dinosaurs, starting with filmed backplates of the locations, or for more complex moving shots, multiple backplates. According to Nigel, 150 days of shooting and filming on location were needed to gather the required elements for the episodes. The animals themselves would start off as clay models created in fine detail, which were then laser scanned and uploaded as 3D models into the computers. Digital skeletons are then added to the animals to allow the animators to create movement in a similar method to stop-go animation. The computer has the advantage that the movements can be saved and replayed with perfect precision whenever you like. A unique challenge of Prehistoric Planet was that the humans would often have to interact or even speak to the animals that were never there. During filming, the human cast would act towards poles with balls on top to provide an eye line to ensure that once the final shot was created, they would be looking in the right direction and to guide their responses. Rod Arthur explained in the making of featurette his style of acting for the invisible animals, stating that you have to build an imagined world in your mind, and that he is someone who tends to talk to his dog a lot of the time, so he used that style for him talking to the animals. Everything the CGI animals would do had to be created without them, including physical interactions but also their sound effects. Jovan Ada would be part of the team to create the sounds of Prehistoric Park's animals, using everything from gravel to biting into a raw cabbage to represent every noise and sound the animals would make. Once all these elements were completed, they would be combined in a process called compositing to create the final completed CGI shot. In the making of feature, the CGI team stated that they believed the hardest shot in the entire program was the Dinosaurs death roll, a scene that was already tough but made unforgiving by Jasper James filming it in slow motion. For other interactions, the animatronics would be used. 13 animatronics would be built, with one of the most significant being for Martha, the park's mammoth, that would be rescued in episode 2. Most of the time she would be a CGI animal. However, the producers also wanted Martha to interact with the real elephants she would be living alongside in the park. For this, they made use of an animatronic. There was some concern the elephant would ignore or worse still attack the animatronic. However, much to the producers' surprise, the real elephant would attempt to interact with Martha the animatronic mammoth as if it was real. The final element to the episodes would be the soundtrack. Created by Daniel Pemberton and performed by the City of Prague Philharmonic Orchestra, it would provide Prehistoric Park with its unique soundtrack, which I want to talk more about a little bit later. Prehistoric Park would go on to premiere on the 22nd of July 2006 on ITV to 3.5 million viewers and would go on to be nominated for a Visual Effects Society Award.
One day Nigel plans to breed extinct animals in captivity.
Prehistoric Park's paleo documentary come drama plays out over 6 episodes, with each episode primarily devoted to a particular time period and a particular target animal. Nigel is sent back in time through a time portal to rescue the animals, where they can be brought back to the present day and given a second chance at existence. The episodes utilize both a documentary style and a narrative style. Each episode plays out in a relatively similar way, split between the ongoing rescue attempts by Nigel and his team in the past, and the ongoing activities of the park supported by Suzanne and Bob in the present. I think it's worth just briefly spending some time summarizing each episode, as it will help in the next sections. In episode 1, Nigel starts his adventure by deciding to go back in time to rescue a T-Rex, jumping right in at the deep end. Bob works to get the park ready for its first guests, although this goes awry when Nigel returns ahead of schedule with a singular male Triceratops that would go on to be called Theo and a flock of Ornithomimus. Nigel would eventually get his T-Rex in the form of 2 juveniles, a male and female, which would go on to be called Terence and Matilda, who he would save just moments before their death at the hands of the asteroid that was destined to wipe them out. At the park, Theo starts to demonstrate some odd behaviour, which Suzanne establishes as possible mating season rutting, which inspires Bob to put together a padded tractor similar to what are provided to rhinos to give Theo a target challenge. In episode 2, Nigel heads to the turn of the Ice Age 10,000 years ago to rescue one of the last woolly mammoths. He finds it difficult to find one, however comes across a wounded, weak female. He protects the mammoth from human and wolf hunters overnight and brings the animal back to Prehistoric Park for care. Back in the park, the Ornithomimus are refusing to eat, which eventually leads Bob putting them into a new style of enclosure, more suited to ducks. Suzanne performs surgery on the mammoth to remove a spear blade lodged inside her and puts the mammoth on the road to recovery, but things are not easy for Martha. While healthy, she refuses to eat, resulting in Nigel returning back to the past, but further back to when mammoths were abundant, to explore what foods they're eating. During this escapade, he rescues an Elasmotherium, a woolly rhino, which becomes a new guest at the park. Martha still refuses to eat. Nigel eventually suggests getting the elephants to integrate Martha into their herd, which succeeds. Episode 3 sees Nigel trying to recover the recently discovered Microraptor, a feathered dinosaur from Cretaceous period China. However, trouble starts soon after his arrival. Intense volcanic activity makes the region dangerous, and worse still, small carnivorous dinosaurs may long attack his team. Nigel eventually comes across his Microraptors, but fails to catch any. Back at the park, Bob is concerned about one of the Ornithomimus sitting on its own away from the flock, but a scan by Suzanne discovers she's ready to lay eggs. However, trouble at the park starts when the 2 Tyrannosaurs begin a fight, which requires the use of a mobile water cannon to stop them. The 2 T-Rex will have to have a new wall put into their enclosure to separate them. Back in China, Nigel uses a new net cannon to capture the Microraptors, but a sudden volcanic explosion causes a stampede with some nearby Titanosaurs, resulting in him having to risk getting crushed to rescue one of them. Not only does he return to Prehistoric Park with the Microraptors, but also the herd of sauropods, which will go on to remain a constant problem for the park to manage, highlighted them by destroying the wall Bob has made for them at the end of the episode. The female Ornithomimus lays the park's first dinosaur eggs. Episode 4 has Nigel travelling back in time to rescue a Smilodon, but also wants to rescue a terror bird too. Nigel decides to observe the animals during their heyday a million years ago to learn what he can about the 2 animal groups. Back in the park, Suzanne notices several dinosaur eggs have rolled out of the Ornithomimus nest, so rescues them, and Bob places them in an incubator to hatch them himself. Nigel manages to attract a terror bird to the park, rescuing his first target. He then returns to 10,000 years ago, where Smilodon were on the verge of extinction, with real-life big cat expert Saba Douglas Hamilton to rescue the Smilodon. After a difficult time finding any saber-tooths, they eventually come across a female struggling to help her cubs and a territorial and aggressive male. The pair of them manage to dart both animals, however the female's cubs have died of starvation. starvation. Back at the park, the baby ornithomimus hatch, resulting in the park's first successful prehistoric breeding program, with the rescued eggs later hatching due to being too cold and the 2 young dinosaurs imprinting to Bob. Episode 5 sees plenty going on at the park. The male and female Smilodon, now in better condition, do not seem to like each other, scuppering plans for them to successfully breed. Nigel returns from a trip to Scotland to find out a serious emergency is ongoing. Matilda has broken into Terence's enclosure and a serious fight has occurred, with Terence being significantly wounded. Nigel leaves the animals in care of vet Suzanne and heads to the Carboniferous to rescue some giant bugs, including the giant dragonfly Meganeura, which he struggles to catch with a large net. Back at the park, Bob is still struggling with the Titanosaurs, who will not stay in any part of the park, and in this episode interrupt his attempts to build the park's bug house. But he suspects that they're looking for gastroliths, so supplies them with stones. Also in the park, Suzanne adds some enrichment materials to the Smilodon to try to make them happier with each other, which seems to work. However, her focus is primarily on Terence, who now has blood poisoning. Suzanne resorts to giving him antibiotics. Nigel encounters Arthroplura and the giant scorpion Pulmonoscorpius. He succeeds in rescuing a single example of these animals just before a huge forest fire destroys the area, saved by a Titanosaur who pulls his jeep free of the swamps. Terence is doing better with his injuries by the end of the episode. The final episode sees Nigel travel back to rescue a Deinosuchus, the world's largest crocodile. The Smilodons have successfully bred, leading to the second of the park's successful breeding programs, with 2 cubs being born that Suzanne is looking after. Bob is having trouble with the terror bird that keeps escaping its enclosure due to dust bathing too close to the fence. Nigel observes the Deinosuchus making a number of kills before constructing a trap to collect one. Martha is having issues with the elephants being isolated again and prevented from socializing with the baby elephants in the herd. Nigel plans to capture the Deinosuchus is interrupted when some Troodon attack the trap and steal its bait, causing Nigel to have to offer himself to the croc. It works and the park provides a nice pond for the Deinosuchus, but carnage soon ensues. When a wild Troodon sneaks back with Nigel and attacks Bob, it causes the park's Titanosaurs to stampede, smashing through fences all over the park. Various animals are released, including Matilda the Rex, who attempts to eat Bob before she goes for the baby elephants instead. Luckily, Martha is there and she defends the baby elephants from the Rex, who turns her attention to Nigel. He just about evades her teeth thanks to the Deinosuchus and brings Matilda to the cages just in time to capture her and contain the situation. Martha's heroics bring her fully into the elephant herd.
There's a buzz of excitement as the park awakens to the pitter-patter of tiny 3-toed feet.
So what makes this show stand out amongst the other dinosaur documentaries of its day? Well, let's start with a very simple thing. Each episode is nearly an hour long, in order to be shown on ITV with regular advert breaks. This makes the episodes longer than any of those in the Walking With shows, and the result is that obviously with the greater length, it means the show can do more with the time, take its time to establish elements, and make greater use of the CGI as well as its human characters. Then on top of that, we need to talk about the actual episodic nature of the program. Prehistoric Park takes advantage of something called serialization. Shows with multiple episodes can take 2 different forms. Episodic shows tell episode-length stories, often with little input from other episodes. Serialized shows, however, tell integrated narratives which rely on the other episodes to tell an ongoing story. Think Game of Thrones or Star Trek Deep Space Nine. In the 90s and early 2000s, serialization on TV was still rare, although thanks to the rise of digital media and streaming services, it's more or less the standard now. Serialization works significantly in Prehistoric Park's favour, as it means that the show can develop a strong narrative through the 6 episodes of this pseudo-nature documentary, and this in turn helps to connect the episodes together, but also helps to develop the ongoing stories, not just about the park, but the animals as well. In fact, for this show, the animals themselves are significant characters, going through ongoing character arcs through the program. This can be seen most heavily with Terence and Matilda the 2 Rex, and Martha the Mammoth. Martha the Mammoth herself, I think, is one of the standout narrative arcs through the show. She goes through many trials and tribulations. Discovered seriously injured and on the verge of being killed by prehistoric man, Martha is brought to the park only to find it hard to live without her kin dying of loneliness. Although she manages for a time, further problems are soon encountered. Her Ice Age adaptations make living in the South African climate troublesome, more on this later, and her struggles to integrate into the elephant herd almost result in her progress collapsing. It is thanks to her bravery tackling a T-Rex, an action that demonstrates just how far she's come from her rescue, that brings her into the herd completely, and the show makes full use of this, presenting the whole event as the actions of quite the heroine. But for every hero is a villain. In Prehistoric Park, that form is certainly taken by Matilda, the larger female T-Rex rescued in episode 1. Matilda is written as the problem child out of the two T-Rex. She bullies her brother before going on to almost kill him. Upon escaping from her enclosure, Matilda is the driving antagonistic animal, trying to kill Bob and Martha before going after Nigel. Terence, meanwhile, is often portrayed as the victim of his sister's abuse, and the serious attack that threatens his life is played intensely seriously by the program. However, these are not the only animals with narrative arcs through the show. The other creatures often have smaller arcs. The Ornithomimus initially have trouble with the ostrich-style enclosure Bob put them in first, so end up in a new duck-style enclosure after a suggestion based on their fossils. They are then the first animals to breed at the park, leading to the success of their egg incubation. Titanosaurs, meanwhile, are persistent problems in the park, since, from their inclusion, they escape every paddock made for them by Bob, require the planting of thousands of trees, and generally make a nuisance of themselves, leading to a lot of stress for poor Bob, until he eventually learns that they can be placated with gastroliths. The saber-tooths get their own breeding story to give the species a happy ending after what was one of Prehistoric Park's more emotionally driven episodes. In fact, it should also be noted how strong many of the emotional beats are in the show, not just around the saber-tooths, but also Martha's story. While not all the animals get as much development, more about that later, the serialized nature of the show allows for interesting narratives to play out. It makes the park feel more realistic, and that realism is something established in more than just the park's serialized nature. The show itself reminds me of various documentaries that started to become popular at the time, which used new science and methods to attempt to make the various topics more engaging for the common audience. This included programs about real or prehistoric animal robots fighting, historical soldiers in combat, and have gone on to be shown in later shows, such as a program from some years ago where National Geographic pretended to conduct an actual autopsy on a dead T-Rex. Prehistoric Park avoids becoming the frat bro science that we saw in Dinosaurs with Stephen Fry, however, by taking a more scientific and serious approach to itself. It is established early on that we should consider the show as a real ongoing event, with narration establishing that Nigel Marvin has plans to establish a more significant prehistoric conservation program, but wants to test his practices first at Prehistoric Park on the small scale. The park itself even has its own logo to provide legitimacy for itself in much the same way as Jurassic Park, but also many real-life zoos. Even before the animals are in the park, there is an acknowledgement of the dangers involved, with Nigel explaining the location's inbuilt natural security, and Bob's insistence on his enclosures being checked and rechecked due to the dangers of the animals within. This devotion to trying to present a realistic park and its daily operations helps with the much needed sense of immersion that a program like this needs to be successful. All paleo documentaries, especially ones filmed like real nature documentaries, require the viewers to have a suspension of disbelief in what they're seeing. In other words, a show like Prehistoric Park can only work if the viewers are willing to become immersed in the idea of the show. Maintaining a sense of realism helps with this. There are a number of ways the show does this throughout the episodes. Each episode wove in the science of the day, often used as justification but also education for many aspects of the episodes. For example, many of Bob's scenes incorporate communications from experts explaining the discoveries of sauropod gastroliths, for example, or the theory that Ornithomimus were more like ducks due to similarities with their beaks. While not all of the science remains correct to this day due to recent discoveries or changes in thinking, the fact that so many aspects of the show uses science to justify itself, and the fact that many aspects of the science make sense, for want of a better term, provides an air of legitimacy to everything going on and adds to the realism so important for immersion. Another aspect of this immersive realism comes from the medical care the animals receive. Suzanne is no actor playing a vet, she's a real life vet herself, so she's able to bring her real world knowledge to the show when required. For example, when handling Terrence's injuries, she explains the correct way for sewing up wounds on reptiles, explaining why it's done in a particular fashion. She goes on to explain that using modern day antibiotics on the Rex is dangerous and wants to avoid it. There's no pseudo-science like Jurassic World Fallen Kingdom's blood transfusion from a T-Rex to a raptor, or magic goo that cures every malady like Jurassic World Evolution 2 uses for its animals. All the technology we see is real and current, down to the ultrasound Suzanne uses to locate the eggs in the ornithomimus. In fact, her whole vet room setup is very cool, with animatronic animals used and dressed up as if they were in a real surgery. It reminds me of well-made medical dramas you see on TV, including how gnarly some of the injuries look. A far cry from anything seen in Jurassic World Evolution 2, and it helps demonstrate that actual experts are part of the experiment. Connected to the medical side of the animal's care is the general focus of the show on understanding the animal's behaviours, and the focus on how difficult it is to look after these creatures. This is not a show where an animal is rescued and everything is hunky-dory. The show goes to great lengths to establish the difficulties of looking after animals long extinct, and how surprising their behaviours may be to us. These difficulties are mostly focused on some key animals. The boisterous T-Rex siblings highlight how dangerous and difficult it is to look after carnivorous dinosaurs, especially when they don't like each other. Martha highlights the troubles of social Ice Age animals being brought to the current day. The saber-tooths highlight the importance of environmental enrichment on captive animals for their health. On top of the medical side of the show, which always feels realistic, these behavioural troubles and difficulties, which in some cases played for humour, such as the wild titanosaurs, help to provide some grounded realism. This is further helped with Nigel's own obvious knowledge of the subject materials and knowledge of tracking animals down in the real world. Connected with that real life knowledge that Nigel has about the animals is the show's utilization of real current day animals. This can be seen most significantly in the use of an elephant herd to interact with and provide a backdrop for Martha, the show's mammoth. Not only do the real elephants interact with the animatronics, but by being able to show the mammoth and elephants side by side, it helps to better demonstrate the differences as well as the size of the mammoth. Other real life animals that show up include a cheetah, which Nigel uses to explain how saber-tooths might have gone extinct due to hyper-specialization, parrots alongside the Microraptor, and real crocodiles. Something else I think is very relevant to the show's conservationist ideology, and something I don't see mentioned often, is that elephants and cheetahs themselves are species at risk of extinction in the wild due to various causes, and using them in this show helps to add more weight to the conservation purpose of the park. It also demonstrates why conservation is important, because if more is not done for many of these animals, then they'll end up as the same CGI ghosts as the prehistoric animals that the show is focused on. A final aspect to the realistic depictions is that things legitimately go wrong. There are very few examples of manufactured calamity. Instead, things go wrong as a natural part of looking after these animals. And when things do go wrong, they're approached with the same level of realism as the rest of the show. While the show does have the two T-Rex fighting, it's nothing as sensationalized as it would be in some frat bro science show or Jurassic World. The T-Rex fight is short and brutal, as most fights between animals in nature are, and is built up to in previous episodes, demonstrating Matilda's growing indifference for her brother. The fight is broken up with a water cannon and later tranquilizer guns. Other problems the park faces are handled in much the same way. When the terror bird escapes due to taking sand baths too close to its fence, it shows up where Bob is working. Instead of some chase scene or attack, the bird instead just acts curious. It doesn't instantly become a murderous creature. Looking at you, Jurassic World. The sauropods are a constant problem, and yet they aren't going around destroying buildings for no purpose. They just walk about seeking the gastroliths they need. And once Bob understands this and provides for them, they become much easier to care for. The only place where this realistic approach to problems does somewhat diminish is in the final moments of the final episode. where the show revels in some Jurassic Park-esque chaos as the sauropods stampede and break down a number of the walls around the park, leading to a total loss of containment. But even here, the show resists the urge to become excessive. When Martha and Matilda face off, there is no coming to physical blows, but instead it's a face-off based on size and potential of a fight. Just like in real life, where many animal engagements are handled without physical violence, the same thing happens here. While those used to prehistoric kaiju fights might have been disappointed that they didn't get to see the mammoth and T-Rex come to blows, I for one praise the show for holding off resorting to such Godzilla-style tactics, and I think the show earns the chaos-driven finale by the end. Moving on from the show's realism, we come to one of the biggest advantages the show still has even now, and that is within the animal lineup. While other programs have focused on various time periods within them, such as Walking with Beasts focusing on the Cenozoic, and Walking with Monsters featuring the Paleozoic, Prehistoric Park takes advantage of its time travel premise to highlight creatures from all over Earth's paleo history. While the show does obviously make use of dinosaurs heavily as a key way to get people interested in the show, it mixes up the pack with prehistoric bugs from the Carboniferous, saber-tooths and mammoths from the Cenozoic, and while in the final episode he does return to the Cretaceous period once more, this time it's in pursuit of a giant crocodile, not a dinosaur. For paleo animal nerds like me, seeing all these creatures in one place would be amazing, and for those not as well versed in prehistory, it helps to make some of these perhaps lesser known animals more famous. I had a real life example of this. While I was in university, I put on the Smilodon episode while I was in the kitchen cooking, and naturally some of the other folks I was living with came to watch and hang out. While they had all heard of the saber-toothed cats, it was the giant terror bird that got their attention, none of them even knowing that such animals had ever existed. This is just a small example of the potential that the show has with its exploration of lesser known prehistoric animals. Diversity really works in its favour. The actual animals, the CGI and the animatronics are one of the weaker areas of the shows these days, but I argue still in many cases they hold up. The animatronic Ornithomimus and Rex, along with the others such as the animatronic Scottish amphibian we see in episode 5, still hold up in my eyes and look so much better than any of the animatronics used in Jurassic World Dominion. Of course, this doesn't surprise me given that it's the same company that worked on Walking with Dinosaurs and others. The quality of that program remains here. One of the best animatronics used on the show in my opinion is the Meganeura, a giant dragonfly. Its animatronic just looks really good close up. Due to its age, the CGI is probably one of the weaker aspects of the show, and more on this later. But as said, this is mostly a result of the program being around 20 years old, and even in that case there are still many great CGI shots that hold up to this day in my view. The first sighting of the Triceratops in episode 1 still looks great, as does the show's representation of the asteroid impact. Later shots of the mammoths in episode 2 or the Smilodon attack in episode 4 look fantastic still. The shots of Bob driving his jeep around the Titanosaurs in episode 6 equally looks great, and not only do many of these CGI shots still hold up, it should also be noted that the show also attempts to have some very bold, unique CGI shots. For example, one of the toughest shots in the show, the Deinosuchus death roll, while not perfect, is certainly a unique element to the episode. Other shots include the use of the difficult and complex moving CGI shots, such as the Smilodon attack, or the various shots of Microraptors in flight with trailing cameras. The ride on Triceratops shot in episode 1 is equally well done. One of my favourite CGI shots comes at the end of episode 5, where one of the T-Rex siblings is shown roaring against a sunset. I think it's just a really beautiful shot, and on top of the quality of the CGI and the animals is the actual depiction of these animals. While the T-Rex is rather spoiled by this skin-tight interpretation that dominated this period of paleo artistry, others are brilliantly done. The terror bird is amongst my favourites with this sandy yellow and black patterning. The Arthropleura and Meganeura also look fantastic, as does the Microraptor. In fact, the Microraptor deserves a special mention, due to its depiction being very good for a newly discovered animal. Not only is it accurately portrayed fully feathered, but the coloration is also spot on to what new scientific tests on the fossils have discovered, as being mostly black like a crow. But for me, the show's defining design is Theo the Triceratops. I adore the almost Rorschach-test patterning on the frill for the males, and the subtle use of this light sky blue really helps make these animals stand out. Much like how I think no one has made a better Stegosaurus than Walking with Dinosaurs, I think Prehistoric Park's Triceratops is peak Triceratops. Alongside the animals is the human cast, and this is another huge advantage for the show. Nigel Marven brings his natural charisma in spades. A mix of Indiana Jones and Steve Irwin, he brings so much energy and drive to the program. Bob has this lovable everyday working man feel to him, often almost pulling his hair out as a result of Nigel's antics, but also comes with a soft-hearted nature towards the animals. Suzanne brings this motherly tenderness to the program, as well as a somewhat exasperated attitude to the boisterous actions of the boys. All three of these cast members work really well alongside each other too. You feel that these are people that work alongside each other day to day, and they bounce off one another very realistically. A good example of this comes in episode 2, where the team discuss the ongoing problems with Martha the Mammoth. The meeting is shown as a very serious discussion, with all sides raising very valid arguments and concerns. The human cast is also very important for getting across much of the educational aspects of the show, but again, this is done in a very good way. Instead of just a dump of scientific exposition, the educational aspects are instead presented in a very conversational way, as if the film crew were part of some news program or documentary at the park. There is also the strong use of imagery, whether it's pictures or images of real-life fossils, which are used to get the points across. At no point is the audience ever spoken down to or told something painfully obvious. Special mention also has to go to Sir David Jason, one of the defining voices of British television alongside Sir David Attenborough. Sir David Jason brings his all to the narrative role. His natural charm comes through at various points of the show, but he's also capable of getting across the more emotional beat at the show's sadder moments, while also bringing that Del Boy spirit for the show's more comedic moments. David Jason is not someone I would ever have thought would narrate a paleo documentary, but I'm glad that he got involved. One of the biggest things that still holds up about the program is the fantastic soundtrack by Daniel Pemberton. This soundtrack gives Prehistoric Park a beautiful suite of music and a unique distinctive feel alongside other paleo documentary soundtracks. Its opening theme establishes a clear melody that you'll hear throughout the show before opening into a fast-paced drum beat, which brings to mind the Uncharted games more than a paleo documentary. The theme, Entering the Park, has a slow, relaxed tune with clear African vibes conjuring feelings of the everyday, but also helps to give it a mystical feel. Many of the locations used in each episode have their own distinct themes, establishing their otherworldly nature, but also bring across a sense of danger and mystery. Martha's music is often very emotionally tinged, with a great sense of sadness when we first encounter her in the Ice Age alongside her dead sister. A soundtrack we hear a number of times is a booming soundtrack first used in episode 1, where the Mother Rex fights an intruder. The heavy use of drums and brass really give it a unique feel, and the whole tune comes across as very boss monster, if I can use a video game parlance. It really goes well with the idea that these are two very large, fierce animals fighting one another. while on the other side you have a wonderful theme called Open Plains, a very calm, beautiful melody to play alongside wonderful landscapes that often accompany it, with significant use of strings to help give it its feel. The theme Magical Flight has strong, almost Egyptian vibes, which suits an episode focused on giant crocodiles and builds up to this Dinosaurs leap that results in something very Walking with Dinosaurs at its peak. Another common theme, called rather suitably Saving the World, is often heard during the show's big moments, usually when an animal is successfully rescued, but is first heard at the end of episode 1, when the 2 baby wrecks are saved from the asteroid impact, and again is a very fitting, triumphant tone. There are a number of shorter tones heard throughout the episodes, often with a playful nature, usually to highlight when something has gone wrong around Bob. The final tracks I want to mention are the tracks that play in episode 6 when the park suffers its mass breakout. The actual escape theme has a suitable energy to it, and danger to it, which reminds me of J-Pog's own breakout music. The music builds up as Nigel has to go rescue Bob from Matilda the Rex, the chase like nature getting stronger and stronger, much like a Jurassic Park theme or a theme from Indiana Jones, or even perhaps something you'd hear in a James Bond film. Overall, I really can't understate how amazing the show soundtrack is. Much like Walking with Dinosaurs and its grand orchestral themes, or the African-inspired drum-heavy tribal beats of Walking with Beasts, the Prehistoric Park soundtrack really has no right to go as hard as it did, but it really does work for the show. The final thing I want to discuss in this section is how the show manages to have an important conservation message without ever coming across as being excessively preachy to the audience. In recent years, there's been a significant social pushback against various environmental groups, often whose rhetoric and methods go too far and end up alienating the very people they're trying to convince. Prehistoric Park manages to walk the fine line between message and rhetoric. While the show highlights conservation needs for animals, the show never directly blames humankind. Even in episode 2, where human hunting of mammoths is mentioned, the show also explains the other factors that were part of the process, such as the changing climate and retreating ice. The actions of the cavemen in hunting the mammoths is not vilified as evil behaviour, as it seems popular to do these days. I think this is really important for Prehistoric Park's enduring legacy as a show, as it manages to make a point without resorting to excessive over-the-top statements or vilification.
Nigel and Saba are ready to take both the adults back to the sanctuary of Prehistoric Park. But it's not quite the happy ending they were hoping for.
Of course, with the good comes the bad, so let's investigate where the show perhaps doesn't do as well. The first and most obvious thing to mention here is the CGI. For many modern day audiences, the quality of the CGI will be the first thing they notice. Now, in one respect, it's unfair to criticise the show's CGI for being old, and as I said previously, there are many good CGI shots that still hold up. but there are some rather bad shots in here too, even for the time. Some of these CGI shots still look pretty bad when you look at programs like Walking with Dinosaurs or Walking with Beasts. Some of the Dinosaurs shots in episode 6 look very poor, as do the Albertosaurus in the same episode, just clearly retextured T-Rex models that float on the sand. There are other examples through the episodes where even for the time the CG slips up here and there, but I think the T-Rex and many of the T-Rex shots in episode 1 are particularly bad for this. Not only does the model suffer from the skin time modelling, but the shots are often let down by the implementation of excessive amounts of motion blur and slow motion. While thankfully this is not seen in other episodes, it is poor in the first episode, which is strange considering in the same episode we have some great CGI shots like the ride along with the Triceratops as it gores a Rex in self-defense. Connected to the CGI is the show's reuse of multiple shots throughout the program. While a natural part of television production, it becomes especially noticeable in Prehistoric Park. A good example of this is the excessive reuse of Theo's fence charging that, while only seen once in episode 1, shows up in numerous episodes after, each time being identical. Then we have the reuse of various shots of Matilda and Terence. The most noticeable one of these is during episode 6, where Matilda's well-grown CGI model gets replaced by her juvenile model for a few shots of footage to show her jumping at the camera before switching again. Again, while I can forgive the show for using some of the tricks of TV, they do also stand out and can start to become a little annoying as they take you out of your immersion. Another area of weakness is attached to the serialized nature of the show. While I earlier pointed out how great it was that the number of animals got evolving character arcs through the 6 episodes, it also means that the number of other animals are more or less forgotten about. The woolly rhino shows up very rarely, as does the terror bird after their rescue. Theo is more or less forgotten about after episode 1, strange considering they named him. The Microraptors, key animals of episode 3, mostly never show up again. It also meant that animals rescued later on, like the giant insects, also do not get time to ever show up again. While perhaps unfair to criticise given the show was only ever given 6 episodes, and as such had to be selective over what animals were given attention, I do wonder if too much focus was put on some at the cost of others. I find the treatment of poor Theo particularly insulting. Connected to this is the problem of time passing. Serialised stories work best when it's made clear that time has passed. Prehistoric Park, however, never makes that very clear, so it seems to suggest that both Matilda and Terence the Rex grow to near adult sizes in a few weeks. If real time were applied, it would take them years to grow to such size. It is interesting to note that they did a better job with the ornithomimus, with younger, smaller animals appearing in episode 6 after their hatching some episodes ago. While again pushing it in terms of growth, I can find it easier to believe a baby ornithomimus has grown into a young juvenile in a matter of months or perhaps a year than a baby Rex becoming full grown in the same time. Another area of weakness for the program is in the realm of mistakes and errors. Naturally, given how fast some areas of paleontology move, it's only to be expected that there are some scientific errors that crop up. Walking with Dinosaurs, for example, is full of errors as a result of new science. Prehistoric Park has its own range of issues, although it should be noted a lot less than you might suspect. Probably the largest amongst these is the presentation of the ornithomimus. Recent fossils have shown evidence of feathers on these animals, so this is an example of modern science making something in error. Modern interpretations have also made the duck similarities a defunct theory. A less acceptable error is the use of the flying pterosaur Nyctosaurus in episode 1 when it had gone extinct 15 million years prior, and is probably an example of reusing a model and animations from episode 6 here in episode 1. A number of animals shown in the Carboniferous episode were also extinct by the time the episode was set in. However, given the range of time periods used in the show, I think it's impressive how few scientific errors there are. Looking at you, Dinosaur with Stephen Fry.
But we had to put Prehistoric Park where it was warm because of all the reptiles and the dinosaurs that we're having here. And that's not ideal for an Ice Age mammal.
So in this section, I wanted to go over some other aspects that are neither good or bad, but some interesting things to talk about nonetheless, whether they be nitpicks or ethical questions that remain outside the realm of the show. The first thing I wanted to talk about is the show's complete lack of safety and security. While they know that a number of these enclosures will be home to dangerous animals, Many of the fences used to contain dangerous predators consist of a single layer of logs, many of which are only resting on the ground and not dug deeper for strength and defense from digging. There are also no electric fences at all. While I accept that making full-on metal style Jurassic Park fences for animals like the Rex would have been expensive for the show and would have lessened the conservation natural habitat feel that the show was going for, I can't help but wonder how many staff are being injured working here. The escaping terror bird is another good example of a huge security risk. I also don't believe that the quality of fence shown would stop a charging bull triceratops the way that it does in the show. The wild free-roaming sauropods also represent a huge risk. While the park does have natural defences, there is the entrance area where access to the wider world exists. I can't see the sauropods being prevented from just walking out the front door, so to speak, and the risk of these giant animals is clearly shown when they stampede in episode 6. Another aspect of the safety concern is the capturing of T-Rex in episode 1. While I understand that T-Rex is a famous animal, and while the animals get a good arc in the show, it also highlights the total idiocy of bringing these animals back to start with. The serious threat they present is demonstrated throughout the show, and while it could be argued this is deliberate to highlight how difficult it would really be to have T-Rex in your park, it does also make me question why anyone in their right mind would do it. Related to park security, however, are some greater concerns over animal welfare and the ethics of what was done. This primarily focuses around the two Ice Age animals brought back, Martha the mammoth and the woolly rhino. The first ethical concern regarding these animals is the bringing back of two Ice Age animals to the climate of South Africa. Nigel does attempt to defend this, stating that many of the reptiles being brought back needed the warmer environment. I do not personally think, however, that this is much of a defense. I think it's a serious animal welfare issue to bring two Ice Age creatures used to freezing temperatures and adapted for those conditions to the tropical heat of Africa. The show uses an apparent haircut to these creatures to apparently make them handle the temperature better, but seriously, are we to believe that a slight cutting of their thick hair would help? Both mammoths and woolly rhinos would have had much more significant evolutionary adaptations for their environments, such as thick blubber layers with no amount of hair cutting would help with. These poor animals would forever be on the verge of overheating, if not heat stroke and heat exhaustion. It's ethically unconscionable to even consider bringing Ice Age animals into that sort of environment without some sort of climate controlled area, something the show did do for its insects. Staying with Martha the mammoth, her treatment I also find ethically questionable. The bringing back of a singular animal of its species, preventing any sort of socialization, seems unfairly cruel. It is even accepted within the show that mammoths like elephants were probably very social, so to bring only one back seems unfair to poor Martha. While I accept that the premise of the show is to make these animals feel like the last of their kind, on the verge of extinction, the whole time travel aspect of the show makes this a little pointless, and at the very least, for an animal that the show accepts as being social, relying on modern day elephants to socialize with Martha seems very risky. Martha comes very close to death from loneliness, and this raises ethical questions. The same can be said of Theo, who, like Martha, is shown to be a social animal. The first time we see the Triceratops, we see them in a large group herd. They work together against the Rex attack. Theo, however, is always alone in the park. There is no other animals for socialization, and again this seems unfairly cruel. I can imagine that Theo would develop some very problematic behaviours as a result of his isolation. Connected to this isolation is also the fact that if we are to consider these 6 episodes as an experiment for future conservation, that the park itself is not that successful. The only animals who successfully breed and therefore can be classified as a complete success in their survival as a species are the ornithomimus and the saber-toothed cats, and it should be noted that the saber-toothed cats would be unable to expand their population beyond due to the dangers of inbreeding. Most of the rest of the animals only exist in singles, and as a result do not represent successful conservation. In fact, the show's conservation premise does not really bear out very well in the show. Successful conservation does a number of things. It protects local biodiversity, it restores degraded habitats and ecosystems, and should benefit local and global communities. Very little of Prehistoric Park's actions are in line with this. While outside of the scope of the program, I think it's worth thinking about. Another ethical matter outside of the concern of the show is in the ethics of even bringing these animals back to the current day in the first place. There is no character akin to Ian Malcolm on the show who can question the ethics of the practice of bringing back these extinct animals. There is little mention of why it's being done, only Nigel's desire to breed extinct animals back in captivity, which in itself seems ethically questionable. In an age where zoos and animal parks are facing increasing questions about the ethics of what they do and justifying their existence for conservation and species protection, Prehistoric Park skirts the question. Again, I accept that it's outside the scope of a fun TV show about dinosaurs, which is why I put it in this nitpick section, but I think it does raise interesting questions, especially for those of us who love the Jurassic franchise. One final area I just wanted to mention here, and something totally outside the show's premise and purpose, is the idea of temporal ethics. This calls to my love of Star Trek, but since we're talking about ethics, I do just want to mention it here. The use of time portals to travel back to the past to bring animals to the current day raises all sorts of temporal questions, especially when it comes to altering the events of the past or effecting the future. What if, for example, one of those animals Nigel brought back was supposed to have died, fossilized, and become part of a museum display? What impact would that have had? There is another scene in the Carboniferous episode where he points out some Arthroplura tracks and comments that they might have been the very tracks he saw in the Scottish Islands at the start of the episode. Then he walks on, totally ignoring the possibility of leaving a huge boot print next to them. This is all a bit much for a dinosaur show, but like I said, as a Trekkie, it certainly occurs to me that Nigel could end up altering the future with his actions. Ironic then, that in a few years' time after Prehistoric Park, Nigel would later go on to guest star in Primeval, another Impossible Pictures production featuring time portals and prehistoric animals, only to get eaten in a rather infamous scene.
You can also find some of the cute ones. It reminds me of mine back home.
At the start of the review, I wanted to ask the question, does Prehistoric Park hold up? I think it does, but I think a better question is actually, why does it hold up so well? Especially alongside newer programs like Dinosaurs with Stephen Fry. Well, I think it's pretty obvious why it holds up so well, because it simply does so much right. It's a perfect mixture of the greatest elements of paleo TV that were around at the time. The experience of a legendary production company that could use all their expertise gathered on projects like Walking with Dinosaurs, a cast of human characters that gave it their all, that worked well alongside each other, a charismatic lead who has become a legend as a result of the show, and others within the paleo fanbase, a range of diverse animals that were treated as not just simple creatures designed to chase the cast around, but were treated as real as they could be, a focus on immersion and realism that gave the show a sense of legitimacy. There were no stupid mistakes here, or misinformation. It was reliable and well written. The show also made a bold choice with its serialized nature, something very few other programs at the time were doing, and something unheard of for a documentary like this. It used this style to actually tell a compelling and enduring narrative, looking at you, Rich Newbold. This was a carefully crafted narrative of conflict and struggle, followed by triumph for many of its animals. The show was not afraid to go for the emotional impact, highlighting the sadness that in reality is part of conservation programs around the world. These animals were not just CGI ghosts. They had emotion and spirit. They were as much characters in their own right, aside the human cast, and in many aspects, I think a lot of us were more invested in them than we were Nigel. The soundtrack is unique and well suited. Its use of animatronics and CGI on par with anything of the day, and in many places the program still looks fantastic for a TV show. Prehistoric Park has gathered a cult following for a good reason, because it bloody deserved it. This was no quick cut and shut program like Dinosaurs with Stephen Fry, or some frat bro science program like Dinosaur Fight Club. This was a program put together with skill, and showed a clear passion for its subject material, something I find so lacking in a lot of paleo media these days, and especially lacking in much of the Jurassic franchise, including Jurassic World Evolution. And here is where we can go on to talk about Prehistoric Park's legacy, because it's very clear now the Prehistoric Kingdom is a clear sequel to the show. Not only do we have the return of Nigel Marven to narrate the game, but the game itself includes a number of nods and connections. Look at the logo for Prehistoric Kingdom and Prehistoric Park. I think there's some clear nods here. Then you have the design of the Triceratops, which has some very Theo-esque natures to it. And then you have Nigel Marven's reference to owning a Microraptor back home, in clear reference to those he saved in the show. Prehistoric Kingdom has a focus on animal care and enrichment, in line with Prehistoric Park's conservation attitudes. As an article written for the website CBR puts it, hearing Nigel Marven lament about the Microraptors he has back home resonates with a very specific and loyal fan base. This makes Prehistoric Kingdom more than just another dinosaur game. It establishes it as a spiritual successor to a docu-fiction that deserves more recognition. Prehistoric Park for me still resonates as strong as it did back when I first watched it on TV. It remains a strong program in the alumni of paleo documentary. In fact, to call it a documentary seems wrong. There's so much more emotion and narrative story in here that made it feel more like a documentary. It's a what if, a fantastical scenario, a hypothetical future made real, in many ways similar to a drama or a play. It deserves a place alongside the Walking With trilogy, and in many cases remains better than many shows that have been made since. While Prehistoric Planet certainly looks great, it can't be denied that in some ways the show was a little cold and unemotional, as many nature documentaries can be. Prehistoric Park is anything but. It has heart and soul and life. Thank you for listening to this retrospective review. Hopefully I'll be tackling the Walking With trilogy next. Let me know in the comments your thoughts on Prehistoric Park, if you have or haven't seen it, and what you especially love about it. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe if you're new to the channel for more dinosaur content from me at Triclaw Gaming, and until next time, stay safe, watch out for rampaging T-Rex called Matilda, and goodbye.